Within the ancient epic poem of Beowulf, one of the central themes of Beowulf is his preservation of self-identity. And as Beowulf is essentially a record of heroic deeds, there's a lot of there's the concept of identity, of which the two principal components are ancestral heritage and then personal identity and individual reputation. And that concept of identity is clearly central to the poem. So what we're going to talk about first is the ancestral heritage and the family ties and kinship. So when you start reading the poem, one of the things that you can first pick out is that no character is introduced without some sort of reference to their ancestral heritage. Like, it's always Beowulf, the son of, or Wiglaf, the grandson of. So when you're reading that, you can tell that the Danish influence on the poem is that the Danish had a very strong ancestral heritage, and they had a very good concept of that. And so that's one of my first points, is that people are very recognizable through their family ties. So this concern with family history is prominent because of the poem's emphasis on kinship bonds. Characters take pride in their ancestors who have acted valiantly, and they attempt to live up to the same standards. And so since they take so much pride in their ancestors' valiant acts, then they themselves try to reflect those acts on themselves, and that's another way that they're trying to preserve their self-identity and make an individual reputation for themselves. And so this good reputation is the key to solidifying your ancestral heritage, not only for your ancestors, but also for the lineage that is starting with you. For example, Shield Sheafson, who was the legendary originator of the Danish royal line, he was orphaned. And because he was, in a sense, fatherless, valiant deeds were the only means that he was able to make an individual reputation, since he did not have a father because he was orphaned. So that this self-identity is not only solidifying your ancestral heritage, but sometimes these heroes had to start their own ancestral heritage because they had no one that came before them. Sheafson is a example of that. And one of my last points in this section is that men without ancestral lineages are very lonely. So throughout the novel, well, not really the novel, but throughout the poem, there are many instances where there are characters that are introduced and they might not have as much of a family. And Grendel is one of those, is an example of one of these characters. He does not have a family. And he is often described as being very lonely, and he's joyless, and him just being the main villain of this story, or one of the main villains of this story, will show how, since he does not have a family, that reflects that he has no joy, he is lonely, and he is in essence the villain of the story. And so with the family ties and kinship, the second of the principal components of the concept of identity is your individual reputation. And so throughout Beowulf, the warriors seek fame through feats of strength, bravery in the face of danger, and utter disdains of death, as well as by boasting of their feats of strength, bravery, and disdain for death. The quest for fame is the utmost importance to the warriors within the story and to Beowulf himself, because he is trying to establish himself to the world. So throughout the poem, Beowulf he performs all these great feats of strength, not just to help his family, because he feels that tie of kinship, but it's also to solidify his individual reputation. And so the quest for self-identity and one of the ways that Beowulf is trying to solidify his self-identity is through performing feats of great strength, which will give him fame. And so the quest for self-identity through fame can lead to several problems. So one of the problems is pride. And so in Beowulf, right in the middle, there's a sense that Beowulf starts to become a little conceited about himself, and he is very prideful. And at first, it doesn't seem like such a big deal, but then throughout, you can kind of see the shift of it becoming a bad type of pride. And so that is one problem that can occur to the search for fame. And so pride involves a desire to be great no matter what. And so it kind of severing, it could sever some of those kinship bonds, which is then decreasing your concept of identity. Put in another way, fame in Beowulf is associated with generosity and community, while the pride is associated with greed and selfishness. And second, a man who seeks a concept of identity through fame can also reach shame by bringing shame to himself if its courage fails him. And shame in Beowulf is not mere embarrassment. It's a kind of curse that broadcasts to the world that you and your family and your people lack the courage, will, or might to protect yourselves. One of the examples in the story of this shame is contained at the end of the story when Beowulf goes to fight the dragon and all of the people stay back, even after the hours and hours that he hasn't come back. And so Wiglaf, he is talking to all the warriors and he says, "Why aren't you going to help Beowulf? If you don't help him, you will not only bring shame to yourself and your family, but you'll also bring shame to the entire Yiddish and Danish line." So it's just another example of how the quest for self-identity can succumb to shame. And so the preservation of self-identity in just like reflection is that Beowulf, throughout the poem, to preserve his identity, he performs many great feats of strength and great acts. He contains and he remembers and he reflects upon his ancestral heritage. So that's solidifying his concept of identity, because he's not taking something, in essence, he doesn't have to start from the beginning. He's taking his ancestral heritage and he's building upon that. And he's making the ancestors proud, I guess. And in the conclusion of Beowulf, I think that the instance where Beowulf, his identity becomes clear to himself, because throughout the entire poem, it's him trying to be someone else to the outside world. And it never really says that he's trying to be someone to himself. And so I feel like at the very end of the poem, Beowulf understands who he is and what he must do, and he understands what his identity is. And so that's when he insists that he fight the dragon all by himself. And so that example is basically just showing that he had finally come to terms and he was like, I am proud of who I am. I'm glad with the identity that I've made for myself and and I'm proud of what I did for my ancestral heritage. And so I'm going to prove myself to myself by seeing if I can fight this monster by myself. And so that was my individual oral presentation on the preservation of identity contained within